right, I want to thank those who will be joining us at some point and watching this video. It's the Moorhead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. We are studying through the book of Judges, and we have completed really all of the judges themselves, have gone through all of them all the way down to Samson. And what we are doing is now going to look at some what is called appendices to the book. And chapters 17 through 21 are sort of looked at as the appendices to this book. No other judges are going to be mentioned, and so we're looking at these last 5 chapters. The author shows us really the spiritual dysfunction, probably in a greater way, to look at that and the apostasy and decay of the Israelites during the period of the Judges. And so the events described in these last 5 chapters, we need to keep in mind, do not appear to be in chronological order. I think that's one of those things that drive modern people nuts. It used to drive me nuts. I'm like, why not just put it all in order? Because it seems like it'd be more sensible. But we're looking at sort of a different mindset. In ancient times, that wasn't as important to them as it is to us. For us, it helps us really be able to understand the clarity better. But for ancient people, that wasn't a big deal other than to use whatever they're going to write about for the purposes in which they're writing about it. And everybody in that time period really understood it in that light. So it's really about really looking at it from a different perspective. So these events won't be in chronological order, and we're not even really certain when they fall in there in terms of what the judges. So we need to keep that in mind. The details of the events in the final chapters of the book are presented in the order that the author himself chose to write about these things that happened during the period of the Judges. So without further ado, we're going to read the first 7 verses of chapter 17. And I need a volunteer. Okay, Brother Kendall, if you want to read the first 7 verses for please.
Now there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Micah. He said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver which were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse in my hearing, behold, the silver is with me. I took it." And his mother said, "Blessed be my son by the Lord." He then returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, "I wholly dedicate the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son, to make a graven image and a molten image. Now therefore I will return them to you." So when he returned the silver to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave them to the silversmith, who made them into a graven image and a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household idols, and consecrated one of his sons, that he might become his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes.
Okay, you can stop there. I meant to say 1 through 6, and I have my notes 1 through 7. And so we're going to do 7 through 13. So I apologize for the abrupt halt in the reading, but we're going to save that for the next reading. So what I want you to do is really keep your eye on verse 6, because that really sort of explains, 1 through 5, why we're here. The idea seems to be that Israel is just sort of, it doesn't have what it seemed to once have under the leadership of Joshua. They just really weren't as spiritually defined and spiritually committed as they were previous to this point. So when we read verse 6, and then we come back to verses 1 through 5, it's an explanation for why we have 1 through 5. And it's very bizarre, but obviously that the writer himself wants us to see some of this dysfunction, the spiritual dysfunction. And again, if you recall the fact that a lot of people believe this was Samuel the prophet that wrote this book. The idea is it seems, as bad as things were, we look at King Saul and some of those goings on, in some ways, it seems better than what they had going on here in the Judges. But it really sort of brings out that dysfunction, and really this sort of chapter 17 will be an example of the spiritual degradation of Israel during the period of the Judges. So we'll start there in verse 1. It says, "Now there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah." So the Bible writer sort of placing where this individual is from, gives us his name. This hill country is really talking about a mountainous region. And BibleHub.com says that the hill country of Ephraim is located in the central part of the land of Canaan, north of Jerusalem and south of Jezreel Valley. This region includes notable biblical sites such as Shiloh, Shechem, and Bethel, which were central to the Israelite worship and governance. Shiloh, located in the hill country of Ephraim, served as a religious center for the Israelites before the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital. And it was here that the tabernacle was set up and the Ark of the Covenant was housed for several centuries. So here we have, we're in the area there that this is all sort of going to unfold, where this man, Micah, is from. Micah's name, by the way, means "who is like Jehovah." So the name seems pretty impressive. It's just when we read about what he does that is really unimpressive. And the Bible writer continues in verse 2. He says about Micah, he said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver which were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse in my hearing, behold, the silver is with me, and I took it." And his mother said, "Blessed be my son by the Lord." So here we have a really bizarre situation. So the mother has these 11,000 pieces or 1,100 pieces of silver. They go missing, and Micah really sort of reports that he's the one that took it. So what motivated for him? Essentially said, I'm the guy that took it. You look at the text there. What motivated him to essentially confess to taking the silver from his mother?
They were cursed, I guess.
Okay, so she uttered a curse. And by the way, the 1,100 piece silver, this is sort of a coincidence. It's the same money that was offered by the Philistines to Delilah times 5. So it's quite a bit of money here that's involved. And of course, we're not told why Micah takes the money. It just says that he takes it. Of course, this is a violation of the law of Moses, which certainly shows you Micah has problems with his ethical behavior. He takes it, goes missing, but it seems that he was highly motivated to admit that he had taken the 1,100 pieces of silver because the mother offered her curse. And that's what I really want to get into a little bit here about that. So this is taken from Baker's Evangelical Dictionary of Biblical Theology, and they talk about what that means. And it said in the Old Testament, being cursed includes the loss of everything significant and a lowering to the most menial of positions. The curse is totally under Yahweh's control. It is his power, not magical forces, which brings about the curse. His sovereign decision alone decides who merits being cursed. And you'll recall back in Deuteronomy, where Moses is talking to the second generation of Israelites, and remember they're on Mount Ebal and the other mount, and the idea that they're saying blessings from one and the curses. So the idea is that if you do this and this and this, it's going to go well with you. God's going to bless you. Everything's going to be fine and dandy. Didn't technically say that, but you get the idea. If you do everything you're supposed to, God's going to bless you. And then from the other mount, I guess that's Mount Ebal, Mount Jeroboam, something like that, Mount Ebal. Anyway, then they would say, but cursed is the one who does this, cursed. This is what we're talking about. And so the idea is these curses were under Yahweh's control. They're not magical forces. The idea is they actually have legitimacy to them and will bring about God's intended will on those who essentially disobeyed. But here's something that we need to keep in mind here. and I'm still looking at Baker's Evangelical Dictionary of Biblical Theology. It says, thus a curse could not be used capriciously as a weapon against one's personal enemies. And what you see here, especially in light of what you're going to read about the mother and the son, is that this is sort of being used capriciously because the mother is talking about making these images and is really using it in a way that it wasn't designed to be used. But Micah doesn't know that. Micah's afraid because he has an understanding of what a curse meant. And so as soon as mom starts rattling off that curse, like, I did it, I took it. And this is why he acknowledges it. And we look at this, it says in the text, and his mother said, blessed be my son by the Lord. Now this is interesting. First, there's a curse. Of course, she doesn't know she took it. And as soon as she finds out it's him, she said, blessed be my son by the Lord. The idea is he's done the right thing. He's come forward. And the word bless here, according to Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary, says the act of declaring or wishing God's favor and goodness upon others. The blessing is not only the good effects of the words, it also has the power to bring them to pass. And here in this passage, Arthur E. Kundal and Leon Morris in their Tyndale Old Testament commentaries on Judges and Ruth says, quote, the power of a curse was considered to be very real in the ancient world, not a mere sound on the lips, but an agent sent forth, an active agent for hurt. Their curse could, however, be countermanded by the blessing of the one who had pronounced it, and this is the purpose of the blessing uttered by Micah's mother. The restoration of the money led to the revoking of the malediction. Any questions about verses 1 and 2? Okay. Continue on, verse 3, he says, about Micah, he says, then he returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, I wholly dedicate the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son to make a graven image and a molten image. Now therefore I will return them to you. And so here Micah is really doing what he's supposed to. Should have never taken the silver, giving it back. Does anybody really understand that, what a graven image and a molten image is? I mean, they're both images, obviously.
Well, I think isn't a graven image something that's carved, maybe?
Okay.
Versus a molten image would be formed from molten metal into a shape.
Okay, yeah,
Some
you're,
sort.
so one of them is really just sort of a solid. We put it in some kind of mold. There you have it. The other one, the idea is that you carve it out of something, then you sort of put the metal or whatever it is over it and you coat it. And so it's interesting that they sort of make a designation between them. So the idea that you have these two things, they're obviously called images. And we can see right away, just reading this, the idea that there's going to be trouble with this. But if we think about what an image is, it's really talking about an idol, a representation or symbol of an object of worship or a false god. And Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary says, in biblical times, idols were made in different ways and of various materials. And it talks about being made in metal and wood and sort of the construction. But this is difficult for us to understand why they would want to do this. Can you see a problem here in relation to the Ten Commandments? Why that you're going to run in trouble with this? Because they're under the law of Moses when this happens, right?
Yeah, well, they were told not to have any other gods
Okay.
than the Lord. And I was just going to say, it's kind of a contradiction because I wholly dedicate the silver from my hand to the Lord, but then in turn says to go make this idol.
This is what sort of gets kind of confusing about this, and we're going to come back to that. But I want us to look at Exodus 20. This is where the Ten Commandments are given. We're not going to read all of them, but the part that we need for what we're studying here, this we will read. So Exodus 20, we're going to start in verse 3. We're going to read 3 through 6. Jenna, you want to read that? Okay, very good.
them or serve them. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments.
Okay, very good. I want to look at one more verse and we're going to come back to that. Deuteronomy 27:15. Deuteronomy 27:15. Ryan, do you have that? Okay,
Just verse 15?
just verse 15.
Okay. Cursed is the man who makes an idol or a molten image, an abomination to the Lord, the works of the hands of the craftsman, and sets it up in secret. And all the people shall answer and say, Amen.
This is not something that you want to do, is to make these images. And as you kind of read through this, you don't really see sort of full out idolatry going on here. But you're not really seeing, the mentions about the silver sort of being dedicated to the Lord. And so in taking all of that and sort of the other material that's going to come here about a priest and everything, it seems to be that what's taking place is that Micah, who really sort of represents a lot of what's going on there in Israel at the time, is sort of the idea of a synchronous religion, the idea that you're sort of bringing together, you have the religion of Jehovah and you're bringing in some of the things that's connected with idolatry and you're sort of just mixing them all up. And that appears to be what's happening here. And we can sort of see just from the verses that we've seen earlier, this is a terrible idea. In fact, there is a curse pronounced on it. And I want us to just think about why God didn't want, he didn't want them to make images really of false gods, but why would he not want to make images of the true God? How could that hurt him?
Say that again.
We know from reading the verses here that God was definitely opposed to making idolatrous images, in other words, the pagan gods. But why would God be opposed if you made some kind of representation of God himself?
Well,
Go ahead.
But
Well, I was thinking back, and yeah, you had the commandment in Exodus 20, but it's also understood in Judges that these people have no idea of their history
okay,
because of the golden calf in Exodus 32.
right?
They made that calf to be a representation of God, of
Right.
the God,
Right,
but the Lord's anger burned against them.
right,
And ultimately, Exodus 32:20, he took the calf, which they made, and burned it with fire, and ground it into powder, scattered it over the surface of the water, and made the sons of Israel drink it.
there you go.
And so,
Here's your
yeah.
golden calf smoothie.
Right,
Put it down.
exactly. So they obviously did not recall or didn't know the history that even making an image to the God
Yeah.
is not making God happy.
Yeah, it's really hard. I guess it's, in some ways we're like, how could you miss the boat here? And then we sort of see today and we're like, we kind of think the idea is it seems so plain. But you got to wonder, kind of going back to the incident you're talking about when they made the golden calf. That wasn't an original idea about golden calf. I mean, that really comes from Egypt.
Yeah.
And, we're just sort of going to repurpose, what they were worshiping, and we'll make a golden calf and we'll have a representation of our God. And it just seems like everything, when you read through you read through Deuteronomy and things like that, as they're preparing to go, to the promised land, it just seems so sad that they're so disconnected from that. They're so disconnected from, really all the awful things that went along with that idolatry. Ryan, you had something.
Yeah, I was just gonna add kind of a simple thing to it. It's like they had this intention to make it maybe look like the real God, but how do you know what the real God looks like?
Yeah.
And honestly, that would turn into an idol all in itself, because now the focus is like, oh, I gotta go worship this, which in turn is the idol, not real God.
Right. Right, and so the idea is you have no idea what God looks like. So basically, you're relying on the ingenuity of man to sort of create what he believes God looks like, and that essentially that image itself sort of becomes the focal point of the worship itself. So in some ways, it doesn't seem like it would be harmful, but in other ways, you can totally see how that would, take away and give you the wrong impression about God. If Jehovah God had a representation of something, he was made in some way, in what way would he be different than all these other guys that made their images for their gods? You would sort of get the idea that here's your God, and so we're going to put it in this beautiful temple, and we're going to worship it just like we would, or like the pagans would that way. So you can sort of see that that's a real bad idea. Yeah.
And we naturally do that. I'll speak for me.
Yeah.
Like, for example, like I'm a fan of history, and I got to go to Washington D.C. with one of our daughters when she was in the 8th grade, and I got to see Mount Vernon where George Washington lived, and like, this is the bed that George Washington died in.
Yeah.
Or this is the booth at Ford's Theater where Abraham Lincoln was shot.
We're sort of awestruck.
It's just like really cool
Yeah.
to see those things and think back of the history of those things,
Right.
and and the role that they played, and so we tend to be awestruck by the things of history,
Right.
and they do become a focus, and I think that's why we don't know the exact place where Jesus was crucified.
True.
We don't know the exact manger that he was born in, and I think there's reasons for that, because we would focus on those things.
People
rather
would-
than
That's also why we don't have an original Bible manuscript. So
Yeah,
many people
could
say,
be.
if only we had the original Bible manuscript, we could know if it was changed.
Right.
We could know
Right.
if
That
it
can in a sense be the same thing. The
Yeah,
idea
but we
is-
would sit and worship
The-
paper.
yeah.
Or if
The
you
doc-
found the Ark of the Covenant, oh my goodness!
Yeah.
Wow, we'd have that puppy in a museum, and we would, we'd have all these people coming, and they'd want to touch it, but nobody could touch it because,
Right.
we don't want fingerprints all over it or whatever else. The idea is that there seems to be something there that would draw undue attention to it, and so, I remember a few years ago where somebody said that they, you hear these crazy things like they found part of the cross of Jesus, and they were selling splinters off of it or whatever for X amount of dollars. Somebody, a few years ago, somebody got, I don't know, it was some fish sticks or something, and they got it out of a box, and it, a couple of them froze like a T. And so they took it out, and I don't know, preserved it in the freezer, and they were selling on eBay for, $150 or something. It's just strange. It's strange how people are. And even just a few years ago here in Fargo, probably like 5 or 6 years ago, on 10th Street South, there's a Catholic church there, and somebody, outside the church building, they had a statue of Mary with a couple places to sit out there. Somebody took a baseball bat or something and knocked the head off of Mary. And so when the Catholic Church people found it out, it required a special ceremony to deal with the broken statue, which means there's too much placed on that. The idea is that we don't worship these images. Well, man, if you got to go through this ceremony and all that because of, you desecrated this monument type of thing, something's wrong. And so we can certainly understand that we have that fascination, and we would just sort of be like, imagine if they had the cross of Christ, and we would want to touch it, and we'd want to pray by it, because we would think, you know what, that's probably going to add a little bit more to my prayer if I pray like touching that cross or something. Yeah.
Well, I think that what chapter is in Romans that talks about, in their ignorance, they turn from worshiping the Creator to created things. I think it's Romans 8, maybe.
What's that?
Is it Romans 8 where he talks about worshiping created things rather than the Creator?
Romans 1 talks about that.
Maybe it's
Yeah.
one. Yeah. Anyway, I know that there's a Romans
Yeah.
chapter. It's very apropos, but I think that's when you ask the question, why would God be, frosty about us making images of
Yeah.
him? I think that's it. He wants us to worship the Creator.
Yeah.
Not the created
So
thing.
the idea that God, we're talking to him, we have no idea, really the fullness of God, and I think that sort of gives us that awe and that reverence versus, we made this image here, and that's a representation of our God. That is not going to give us the same sort of sense of awe, the idea that the God can be omniscient and omnipresent, and when you make something, you're essentially trying to bring it into the same realm of a lot of false gods.
Yeah, and
But-
real worship is in spirit and in truth.
That's right,
Spirit.
right.
So, yeah, I think understanding that, faith without sight.
Yep.
It's hard for us, but the other thing it brings to my mind is we could really do a lot of, I think, application to that. If you lived in a time where you didn't know your own faith history well, you didn't
Yeah.
know God well.
Right.
And people in other religions around you worship their gods this way, then why would you not think I'm gonna honor my God in
Yeah.
a similar way?
Yeah.
And I think today we can look around us at other faith traditions and say, well, I like how they worship.
Right.
In that way, I'm gonna worship my God that way.
Right.
But that's not what he asked you to do.
Right. So there's a lot of, there seems to be some failures to have gotten such a low point in their history. Now, even when they get to the kings later on after the best years, so that's Saul through Solomon, I mean, you had a few good kings left in the southern kingdom. You had zero good kings in the northern kingdom, but the idea is they were told up front, the importance of really handing down, what they had been taught to their children, and really making sure that they understood really these significant events in their history. And it seems like at this point, and there'll be other points, the idea is it seems all to be lost. Like, they don't talk about going to these feasts, and they don't talk about, some of these very important things that really are part of what Israel is all about.
One question I would have, and it would take a bit of study, cause I don't really know for sure. But you know how the cycle in Judges is like, everything's bad, they cry out to God, God sends a judge, they get saved, everything's great for a while,
Yeah.
then they forget about it, start doing what's right in their own eyes, and we start all over.
Sure.
Right? So I would be curious, the generational time of that. Like, did it last through the grandchildren? Did it last through the great grandchildren? Cause I think about our families,
Right.
like how hard is it in our own families to
Right.
pass our faith to
Right.
our children, to pass it to their children, and it not get lost along the way.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, there was like 20 years, some of them, 16 years, 40 years, 40 seems to be the most, but there's these periods for the judges, and it just seems like they pull out of it and everything's going well, and the judge dies, and they just crash. I mean, it's, you find yourself in a difficult spot of sort of saying, I'd be smarter than that, and sort of recognize, well, I was lost too, and I needed Jesus to save me, and hey, I'm not perfect today, I'll never will be, but you look at that, and a lot of times the idea is like, what? It happens because people, when I look at these guys and I see, that seems like things are good once the judge, secures their freedom, and then the judge dies, it seems like too much was placed on the judge, and not sort of remember that God was the one that sent him to judge, that helped to bring about, their deliverance. And the idea that now that the judge is dead, the same God is still ruling from heaven, and he's still concerned about what you're doing. He wants you to be loyal to him.
Do you think the 40 years is 40 literal years, or 40 numerological, like complete, or that kind of thing?
The 40 years?
The 40 years that are talked about in Judges so often.
Yeah, like one of them was 40 years. I can't remember which one, but it seems like after things were correct, the idea is if we sort of putting in the mix all these appendices, we sort of see that it wasn't a perfect world then, but it seems like they were in a better place with God than they were, in the midst of a sort of a complete departure when they were, going after idolatry. It just wasn't the greatest environment, and I think that's the purpose of writing about the judges, is because, you know, the idea is the first king sort of gives more stability to the nation. You know, the idea is now, you know, instead of sort of being sort of a loose confederation of states, the idea that we're sort of, you know, we all have one king now and we're more sort of united versus during the Judges, we're going to grab a couple of these, territories and we're going to fight against these enemies, but, you know, they weren't all necessarily involved with that. So a unified Israel turned out to be a pretty good thing until they got bad kings. Yeah.
And they could have been, and I think that's what God wanted, and what he and Samuel were so sad about, is they could have had that
Right.
under a perfect king.
Right, and you know, that's the sad thing. God sort of gives them, and this is the same way for us today, gives them a plan of success, okay? Here it is. Moses is saying, here it is. Okay, now, if you follow this, it's going to be good. And then you end up in Judges, and you're like, what happened? You know, same thing sort of today. You look at, you know, when we look at, you know, what we have in the New Testament, the expectations, the idea is if we are committed to that, life is going to be good. And if we get away from that, well, then we're going to suffer the repercussions of not that ourselves. So you sort of see the lessons there of history, and you see it, you know, how easily in a different way that it can repeat itself. We're just under a different law at a different time.
Because I think a lot about how hard we are on the Israelites as we study them. But think about how old our country is, which is so nothing compared to these timelines that we read about.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, George Washington seems like, oh, that's ancient, you know.
Yeah.
But look at how much we've moved in such a short span of time.
Right.
In thinking and culture and the way that the world works. And, you know, in these times, I
Right.
mean, it was just that long and way longer.
Yeah, and so we can go another direction. The idea is the biblical knowledge and the recognition of God was, I mean, it wasn't perfect in the very beginning because, you know, the reason of our country started is a revolution. So, I mean, we got some troubles there, but, you know, the idea is when the new nation formed, there seems to be this greater awareness, and the idea that you could give them these readers, these English readers, and they would talk about A is for Adam, and, you know, they would talk about all these different things in there. And now the idea that you could go to a public school and like, no, God didn't create anything, and hey, sort of do whatever you want, you're like, wow, what a disconnect. So the idea of these people here, if they could see where we're at now, probably would be stunned. And probably the same thing could be said about, you know, the people of God's people sort of earlier in their history than later, you know, in the good periods. So, yeah, lots to think about and consider for sure. All right, well, we're going to come back to the text here and really kind of move on to what we're here, and we're in verse 3. So the sin that's going on here seems to be, in terms of the graven images and molten images, is really a sin of idolatry. In other words, you have no authorization or authority by God to make these images, and even though you're sort of making them for God, the idea of it being syncretic, the idea is the religion of Jehovah is not allowing you to do that, but the idea that you're bringing in some other things and somehow you're still going to be faithful to God just isn't going to be the case. Leon D. Stancliffe, in his commentary, God's Messages Bible commentary on Joshua Judges, Ruth says, quote, Jehovah is not like unto graven or molded images made by the hands of men. Any image of this kind subtracts from his glory, almost without fail. The one who employs such images in worship begins to worship the image rather than the God whose glory fills both both the earth and heavens. And I think that's sort of what it was saying. The idea is it takes away from really our whole conception of God. So here we see this story, and it's a tragic story. The Bible writer just continues to sort of lay all of this out. And this is the behavior of the people at that time. Micah's behavior apparently is typical of the time during the Judges. And so they're going to take that silver. It's supposed to be dedicated to the Lord, but somehow or another, they're going to use 200 pieces of that silver to to make images. So verse 4 says, so when he returned the silver to his mother, she took 200 pieces of silver and gave them to the silversmith, who made them into a graven and molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. And so it's interesting, the silversmith here is really a metalsmith. I'm reading this from Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary. And so this occupation included those who dug the ore from the ground, refined the metal, and worked the metal into useful objects. And so that's how they make it. And then verse 5 says, and the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household idols, and consecrated one of his sons that he might become his priest. Here's where we can really see how bad things are in terms of the way Micah is approaching things, okay? Any thoughts? What's your thoughts when you see the word shrine in the Old Testament? What comes to your mind? Is that something that is associated with the worship of God? Or is it usually associated with the worship of idols? Idols, okay, very good. And so that's exactly what it says. Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary says this word was always used to describe the temples or sacred places where pagan gods were worshipped. This is how we know Micah's in bad shape here. Even though Mom talks about dedicating silver to the Lord, the idea that you've made these molten images, hey, where are we going to put them? I know what. We're going to make a shrine. We're going to make this place, and then we're going to put our gods in it. That sounds a lot like idolatry, doesn't it? And it says he made an ephod, and this really goes back to what we read earlier in Judges 8:27. Remember it said Gideon made it into an ephod and placed it in his city, and Oprah and all Israel played the harlot with it, so that it became a snare to Gideon and his household. And so if we remember what an ephod is, it's sort of a vest or something that's worn by a priest. The priests of God wore them. It is a religious garment. And that is, it is something that's designated as ceremonial or sacred. And sometimes, as in the case of Gideon, it's used, set up, on an altar, and it's worshipped. What's your understanding of household idols? Anybody remember an earlier period in history of the Bible where the idea of these household idols come out?
There was a girl that stole her father's idols and ran
I'm
off
sorry?
with them. There was a girl that stole her father's idols.
Right,
and ran
Rachel.
off with them.
So remember, she's leaving. Remember, that's that whole thing where Jacob essentially marries the daughter of Laban. Laban's kind of a scoundrel. First of all, he tricks Jacob and he marries the oldest daughter. And he says, "Oh, you stay for me another 7 years, and you can have the younger one." All this stuff. Anyway, so Jacob's sheep are thriving and all that, and Laban's accusing him of stealing his sheep, and they make all these arrangements. Finally, Jacob's had enough, so he says, "Hey, I'm just going to pack up and leave. We're not going to tell Laban." So they leave, and then he says, "Well, I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to my my daughters and my grandchildren, blah blah blah. And by the way, somebody stole my household idols." This is what it is, and of course Rachel stole them, but he never found it out. But this is kind of interesting, the idea of it in ancient times, and this goes all the way back to the time of Genesis. But Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary talks about these figurines or images in human form used in ancient world as household gods. Teraphim is a Hebrew word for idols. It says teraphim were probably of Mesopotamian origin, but apparently they were widespread in Hebrew households, possibly made of clay. These objects may have been similar to the objects in Rome that were connected with superstition, idolatry, and magic. The term teraphim, translated as household idols, occurs in Judges 17:5 and in chapters 18, where it is linked with an ephod and with carved images, molded images. And so all this formed part of the equipment of Micah's idolatrous shrine. So now, not only do you have these images that you've had made, and now you've got these teraphim, it's just bizarre, and it's really disgusting in relation spiritually when you sort of look at the fact that they weren't supposed to have any of that stuff. And again, the idea is it makes no sense to the reader who is really striving to live for Jehovah. In other words, this is a really bad time. This is sort of the crazy stuff that was going on during the time of Judges. And so when we read it, it's that bad, it's that crazy, okay? Then, on top of that, we see in verse 5 that Micah consecrates one of his sons to become a priest. Now, how is that possible since Micah is from the tribe of Ephraim? Where's the priest supposed to come from? It's supposed to come from the tribe of Levi, and it's supposed to be specifically the only priest had to come from a descendant of Aaron. Somehow he's like, oh, hey, it's good. We'll just use my son. Well, if you're gonna do all this stuff, then probably the other one shouldn't be as shocking. In other words, you can sort of start. So you're doing all these things. It's doubtful he followed all of the elaborate stuff that they did under the law of Moses in relation to installing a priest. You had washings, you had anointing of oil, you had essentially the priest's garments being put on, you had animals being sacrificed. That's probably not what took place, but the idea that he was going to be set aside and in some way recognized as the exclusive priest for Micah. And then verse 6 says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And this is the phrase that really is going to help us to really understand the period and all of the stuff that was going on. Imagine the idea is that you have been given a sense of purpose and direction from what God had told you, and that all seems to be lost. The idea that everybody's just sort of shooting from the hip. They're just sort of, whatever religious knowledge they have, because Micah seems to have some. When the Levite comes later, he's got some recognition. Hey, this is going to be better than a non-Levi priest. He's got some of the knowledge, but they're either not committed to the knowledge or only in part. It's difficult to sort of wrap your head around. Any thoughts about that?
I think it just reinforces to me think about Adam and Eve before the fall.
Yeah.
I mean, they had a perfect relationship with God.
Right.
They were connected to Him. They could be with Him.
Right.
You know, they walked through the garden in the evening together. But once sin entered, there was separation. And it's like, even in the time of the law here, people are trying to connect, but they're doing it in the wrong way.
Right.
And I think, a lot of what I hope we can talk about on Sunday with the revelation of the mystery is that since the fall and since all of these things that have happened through the ages, the only way to be connected to God is through Jesus.
Amen. Yeah.
And the only way that we're ever gonna really fully understand the glory of God is in eternity. We just have no concept of what Adam and Eve were able to experience in the beginning. Ultimately, Jesus is the revelation of the mystery that there's only one way to God.
Yeah. I see here, and I think those are very good comments. I see here, so the idea is there's a lack of maybe of to what extent that they knew the law of Moses, we don't know for sure, other than we're getting pieces. They obviously knew some of it, but the idea is they obviously did not have the reverence for God they should have, because if you really reverence God and God says something, you want to make sure that you do what God says. So the idea that you would have this, but you're not really committed to it, or you don't really sort of seek to really understand it. I mean, it seems very puzzling for somebody who's really trying to strive to live for the Lord. You're like, how could you end up in such bad shape?
I
And
wonder though if they really had any learning, you know, like at that time, were they really being served by their priests in the system?
yeah,
Who just didn't have access the way they should.
right. And you know, and I want to get something real quick, Timothy, but you know, the idea is you know, we find ourselves in a lot of ways, not so much with God's people, but even with God's people. But you know, if you talk to the average person, you know, out there, and you talk about, you know, eternity and, you know, people going to heaven and hell, you know, it like it means nothing to them. A lot of people just, you know, they just, that what's not seen cannot be real, and so it's dismissed, and they think you're a Jesus freak, you're a lunatic or something, because you believe in something that they have essentially, they have no commitment to. They just say that's what you believe, but I don't believe it. And so I think having some of that with us and sort of coming back to here, you know, we can sort of see, you know, this isn't really probably as strange as phenomenon as maybe it appears by itself. You know, the idea that you have these spiritual realities that are not, you know, visible to the naked eye, yet the spiritual realities are all in play, and eventually, you know, everything is going to, you know, be, you know, is accountable to God, but it's going to be, you know, all of humanity is going to be judged by God. So, Brother Timothy, thank you for your patience. Go ahead.
Just want to buttress what you say. I think I would say it's lack of commitment on their side, because when God actually gave them Moses the law, he actually instructed them to write them at their hearts, write them on your doorposts, teach them to your children,
Right.
to your children's children. So in that aspect, they failed. Because look at the mother who's supposed to be an example to the son. Instead, she led the son away in terms of Micah's mother and Micah. Instead of teaching the son the right thing,
Right.
but she suggested an idol to be made and to be worshipped. So you see, they fail in their duty to actually teach God's law to their children.
Okay.
And that keeps going on.
It's supposed to be handed down.
From generation, and that's
Yeah.
why things keep going worse and worse.
Yeah.
Just think about it. Just like my home, if I did not teach my children to pray, to honor God, to worship God, and maybe I took everything myself, I want to pray, I pray alone. I don't teach them how to pray, I want to do things of God, I do them alone. Then, probably, maybe one day, I lay down and I didn't wake up, I'm gone. How do I expect them to, they can't follow God.
Right.
They
Right.
will actually derail from God.
Right.
Yeah, so they fail in their duty to actually pass the law as instructed by God to their children, to their children. So that's brought in
Well, yeah.
different ideas, different idols worship.
Right, and that's really the job of the parents. I mean, I have a brother that he sort of he fell away from God, and he just said something like, I'm not going to teach my children about God. And I said, well, why not? I said, well, I'm just going to let them figure it out on their own. Well, why not let them, you know, they got a hot stove there, and let your little kids figure out that on their own, and if they're out playing in the street, hey, why not let them figure it out? Why is it that when it comes to the most important part of their life and giving them that spiritual direction and really the responsibility you have, why would you fail them so miserably? I mean, this is why a lot of people have trouble in the world today. They don't understand their purpose, and then they have a distorted view of reality, like, we're here by accident, so we might as well, you know, grab the bull by the horns and have a great time until we die. You know, and so the idea is that you really have nothing of substance. You know, the fact that the Bible says you're made in the image of God all of a sudden raises man in a higher estimation of all this here, and the idea that God wants you to, you know, fear him and keep his commandments. You have a sense of purpose. These are all very important things, and if you essentially deprive your children of that, they're essentially go into the world by themselves, and they really don't have those things. They're lost. They're lost because they really don't know what their lives are supposed to be about. So it's a terrible injustice not to teach your children about God and where they fit in with all of that. So anyway, I really appreciate all the comments, and we're going to have to finish there for tonight. And Lord willing, we will have we'll pick up here next week. God bless you.